The HiT era is an era of Thomas and Friends that has a mixed reception from fans. Some say it's good and some say it sucks. I for one like this era. I won't bother going into a huge rant about why I like it, but instead I'm going to talk about 10 episodes from seasons 8 through 12 in no particular order that I think are overlooked by a majority of people. Yup, you guessed it, this is based off the Unlucky Tugs video on the hidden gems from the CGI era. Enough chit chat, let's dive in. Number 10, Duncan and the Old Mine. A lot of people say that Duncan was one of the characters that HiT wrote really well, and I agree. This episode shows an adventurous side to him where he wants to do more than pull coal trucks, which I feel is very true to his character. When he sees an old track blocked by a barrier, he pushes through it hoping to be like Indiana Jones. Rusty, on the other hand, tells him off and advises him to do his work. Rusty wasn't exactly in character for most of the HiT era, but this episode gets him spot on. He takes his responsibilities for his work and his friends very seriously, and he doesn't want Duncan to get into trouble. But Duncan is a rebel, and he goes exploring anyway. He then stumbles upon a mine shaft and, you guessed it, he goes in, but he accidentally makes the roof collapse behind him and traps himself. He later discovers some trucks in the mine, and at first thinks they're buffers and that he's trapped for eternity, but when he realises that they're trucks, he pushes them and finds a way out. Rusty, who has been worried about Duncan's absence, finds him, but before he can scold Duncan for his stupidity, Duncan reveals that he's found some coal trucks, which was his job all along. Not only did this episode bring back the Rusty and Duncan duo, but they don't just keep it in its black and white Rusty right, Duncan wrong trope. They show Rusty rightfully telling Duncan to keep out of trouble, and he's proven correct when Duncan traps himself, but they also show that Duncan's adventure paid off, as Duncan found coal that was valuable to their railway. Another big positive about the episode is its model work. The mine shafts are really well made, and they give a claustrophobic yet adventurous feeling to it. Also, this shot of Rusty on the cliffside is eye candy. This episode has a great story that sticks true to character, and has fantastic visuals on its side as well. Number 9, Steady Eddie. Steady Eddie is one of the better episodes from season 12. Most people say Edward is out of character in this episode, and while that may be true, if you look past that, you'll see a lot more positives than negatives. One thing I like about this episode is the opening, where Edward is chosen to deliver a water wheel to Great Waterton. I love Gordon's reaction when Sir Topham Hatt tells Edward to use the express line. I think that's a nice callback to Edward and Gordon. I also like how Edward is tasked with this wheel because he's apparently the steadiest engine on the island, which I think is accurate characterization. I do agree that Edward was a bit out of character when he takes a different route so people can see him with the wheel, but if you change it to him having to take different routes for a reason, I think everything else is great. I particularly enjoy the climatic scene where the water wheel breaks free from Edward's flatbed and lands on Gordon's train for the smelter's yard. Instead of Edward learning his life lesson and getting a new one, he races to the smelter's yard to stop the wheel from being scrapped. He succeeds, and the water wheel is saved. I love the chase scene because it shows Edward's true character. He's determined to save the water wheel, so he races as fast as possible, and he uses his knowledge of Sodor's shortcuts to beat Gordon to the smelter's yard. There's also some smaller details that I like. Firstly, I like how while Gordon fumes at Edward for using his express line, Emily is happy for Edward. I also like how the episode foreshadows that the water wheel is going to break free in the scene with the bumpy track and the signal. I like the scene where Edward struggles up Gordon's hill but is supported by Oliver and Arthur. I love how he shows Gordon up at the start and the end of the episode. The idea of him beating the fastest express engine to the smelters is hilarious, and overall it's a decent end to Edward in the model series. Number 8, Toby's New Shed. I feel that Toby's New Shed is one of the few Toby episodes post season 7 that I like. In this episode, Thomas sees that there are holes in the roof of Toby's shed, and he tells Sir Topham Hatt. Soon, workmen begin to rebuild Toby's roof, but when Toby finds out, he's upset. He reveals to Thomas that he used the holes in the roof to shelter birds from the rain, but without the holes, they have nowhere to live. Thomas finds a solution by using the wood from Toby's old roof to make a birdhouse, which is put next to Toby's shed, and birds immediately come to nest there. This isn't the best episode of the season, but I think it's a really sweet one. I love Thomas and Toby in this episode. Toby wants to give some birds a home and allows himself to get wet in doing so. This episode shows Toby's caring side, which is the one time in any non-classic era that did this. It also shows Thomas's caring side, as he wants to make Toby's shed more comfortable for him, and also tries to satisfy Toby's bird friends as well. We didn't see too much of Thomas and Toby's interactions in the HiT era, but this episode does a great job at doing that. Number 7, Thomas Saves the Day. One of my favourite Season 8 episodes is Thomas Saves the Day. I like it because it makes use of Thomas's dynamic with Annie and Clarabel. Thomas has difficulty remembering to slow down at a certain bend in the tracks, but his 2 faithful coaches are there to remind him to do so. One day, his coaches need to be sent to the works to be refitted. Thomas is upset because that means he has to go past the difficult bend without them. When he tries to pass it on his own, he fails. Later, he sees a runaway train heading towards a building site, and he races to get to the site and warn the builders. He passes the trucks out, but he needs to get past the difficult bend. He reminds himself to go slowly, and this time he does. He arrives at the construction site just in time and warns the signalman, who diverts the train into a siding. After that, Thomas no longer needs Annie and Clarabel to remind him about the bend, as he can do it by himself. This episode is a real slice of life story. It has a great plot about doing life challenges on your own without help from friends or mentor figures, and the writers made a good decision to use Thomas's relationship with his coaches, a dynamic that would become more prominent in the CGI series. Not only is it accurate to the classics, but it has a really cool runaway, one of the few runaways in the HiT era, and it introduces Kelsthorpe Station too. Overall, it's a nice story to be remembered. Number 6. Cool Truckings. Even though Season 11 is my least favourite HiT season, this episode is amazing. This is the debut episode of Madge, the snub-nosed lorry who works on the Skarloey Railway, and it made a unique pairing between herself and Duncan. Like I said, Duncan is one of the best written characters in the HiT era, and his interactions with Madge are proof of this. One snowy day, when Madge has to deliver him to the transfer yard, he makes fun of her for going slowly. Madge gives in to this teasing and picks up speed. She entertains the little engine by skidding along the bumpy roads and spraying snow everywhere. The two are having a great time, until they realise that they're heading towards a cliff. Madge tries to brake, but because she's going so fast, she slips and slides on the ice and then hangs off the edge of the slope. She and Duncan are in grave danger, but thankfully Madge is able to slowly reverse herself back from the edge. The journey to the transfer yard resumes, and even though Duncan still wants to ride the bumpy roads, Madge declines, remembering their near-death experience. They arrive at the transfer yard and all is well. This, my friends, is how you write a new character. Madge is probably my favourite of the HiT newbies. Not only does she have a unique design, but her interactions with Duncan are great. At first she gives in to Duncan's slagging, but when it leads to an accident, she learns to be more responsible, despite Duncan not learning anything. I also love how even though her recklessness gets her into trouble, she's still smart enough to get out of it. The crash and climax near the end are really exciting too, as are the visuals generally. I find it to be a big outlier compared to the rest of Season 11. Number 5. Saving Edward. This is one of the most underrated episodes of the entire show. It's one of the few times after Season 1 where Thomas interacts with Edward, and the writers did a fantastic job. The story begins with Edward feeling unwell, and he fears that he can't be useful anymore. Thomas sees that Edward is suffering and wants to help him. After preparing Edward's train for him, he encourages him to try and deliver it. Edward, however, can't, as he's too weak. Edward says aloud that he'll have to be scrapped, and this upsets Thomas. He doesn't want Edward to die, so he decides to take Edward's train for him after doing his own jobs. He does so, even though Edward is doubtful of Thomas trying to hide his illness. When he arrives at Knapford, the Fat Controller suspects Thomas is hiding something from him and is angry. Later, Gordon finds Edward and tells him about Thomas's dilemma. Edward feels terrible, and he heads to Knapford to sort things out, where he finds Sir Topham Hatt and explains everything, and is told that he shall be repaired in no time. Thomas arrives, and he and Edward apologise for the trouble. This is another episode where people say Edward is out of character, but for me, it's his role in the story that makes it so great. I don't know if the writers knew this, but this is an excellent callback to Thomas and the Trucks, only this time, Thomas offers to take Edward's train to preserve his old friend's life. There's also this piece of dialogue that gets me every time.
Hurry up, he told the troublesome trucks. What for, they snapped. For Edward.
I'm not crying, you are. The icing on the cake is when Edward finds out that Thomas is in trouble and he forgets about his pain to help him. This episode is one of the most heartwarming character interactions ever, and it's one of the best Season 9 episodes for me, hands down. Number 4. James works it out. Do any of you remember that scary hopper truck from Season 11? Well, Season 12's James Works It Out decided to pair self-centered James with Hector the no longer horrid, who has clearly received character development from the last season. The episode starts with James shunting trucks like a pro, and Stanley, who is also shunting trucks, is really impressed. James feels good about this, and shows off some more by shunting Hector with the other trucks. He decides to take his train to Great Waterton immediately, but Hector advises him to wait because of the snowy weather. James ignores him, thinking that engines know better than trucks, and sets off. On the journey, Hector offers tips to James about how to reach their destination without getting stuck, but James is still dead set on doing things his way. This results in him accidentally taking the wrong track and ending up at the top of a hill. He decides to go down it as slowly as possible, but doesn't notice the snowdrift and the trucks get stuck. James realises that his ideas weren't so good after all, but Hector knows a way out of the mess. He tells James to pull him to the top of the hill and to race down it at top speed. James does so, and the weight of Hector combined with their velocity manages to free the train from the snow. James thanks Hector for his help and they arrive at Great Waterton. Despite being a 3 strikes episode, this one is pretty strong. I like how James shuns Hector's reasoning because Stanley's compliments made him conceited. I feel that there's more that could have been done with James and Stanley, by the way. The winter scenery is very well made, and the moral about how trucks can give good advice is unique, especially considering how flawed Hector was in the previous season. Season 12 isn't that bad. Number 3, Squeak, Rattle and Roll. Squeak, Rattle and Roll is the best episode of Season 8. Even though that's just my opinion, I feel that it should be law to have this episode as your favourite of the season. I love this episode's premise. We see Gordon argue with Diesel about steam engines being scrapped, almost similar to a certain Season 3 episode. Gordon at first snorts, thinking he's in perfect shape, typical Gordon, but later hears strange squeaking noises coming from his body. This causes Gordon to worry about what Diesel has said, and that he might actually be sent for scrap. We don't see this side of Gordon too much. How many other times have you seen him fret about his age? Anyway, Gordon makes his way up Gordon's Hill, and realises that the strange noises stop when he slows down. Later, he is taking the Fat Controller and some children to the docks. He goes slowly so Sir Topham Hatt won't hear his squeaking, but when he is scolded for dawdling, he accepts his fate and says,
"This might be my last trip," he said, "but I'll get the children to their boat on time."
Gordon decides that his life is over, and that he should make the best of what could be his final journey, and he goes as fast as he possibly can to please the Fat Controller. After the trip, he is told that he will never be scrapped, and that his squeaking and rattling will be repaired. This episode is a very deep one, for what many would say is a child-proofed season. Gordon fears that he will soon die due to his age, but his pride gives him courage to make the most of his life, almost like in Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. This is an episode which I feel that the Reverend Audrey himself would have written. Number 2. Fearless Freddy. Just like Madge, I think Freddy is one of the stronger characters introduced in this era. In his debut episode, his character is portrayed really well. When he's brought to the Skarloey Railway, he's immediately greeted by Sir Handel, who claims to have been friends with him many years ago, which implies that Freddy had once worked on the Mid-Sodor Railway. I love that scene alone, for adding lore to Sodor and referencing the classic era. Next, Freddy meets Skarloey and Rheneas, whom he does not recognise, but when he sees that they're fond of racing, he challenges them to race against him. I am aware that these two guys are really badly characterised here, but ignore that. The rest of the story is interesting. The race begins with Freddy outrunning the two Flanderised friends, but soon begins to slow down due to his age. He then remembers an old shortcut which he uses to his advantage and takes it, causing him to win. But Skarloey and Rheneas are still determined to beat him, so they have a rematch. History ends up repeating itself. Freddy worries that he'll lose, but finds another shortcut and takes it. However, Rheneas and Skarloey take the regular route, but they end up going so fast that Rheneas derails and slides down a hill. A worried Skarloey finds Freddy and tells him about the accident. Freddy knows this is his fault for cheating, so he owns up. Luckily, his knowledge of all the hidden tracks helps the engines to find Rheneas. They rescue him and go home, where Freddy apologises for his dishonesty. Say what you will about how Rheneas and Skarloey are portrayed in this episode, but I think that problem is outweighed by the positives. Not only do I like the references to the MSR, but I also love how Freddy breaks the old character equals wise character stereotype. This guy may be elderly, but he's also quite reckless and competitive. He's afraid of losing against two quote-unquote young engines and ends up cheating and lying to them, which causes a mishap where he learns to accept defeat rather than break the rules. It's a unique moral that kids and adults alike can learn from this. Bravo, writers. Number 1. Thomas and the Statue. This episode is on par with the classics. Thomas is sent to collect a statue from the docks, and when he sees that the shape of it resembles his own, he instantly believes it to be a statue of him, even though he hasn't seen the actual sculpture yet. The next day, he brags endlessly about it to his friends, and they eventually lose their patience with him. Thomas realises his mistake and he hopes to make up for it, and when it begins to snow heavily, again fantastic winter scenery, he volunteers to clear every line with his snowplow so the others can make it to the statue unveiling. This is a massive sacrifice to him, not only because he'll miss the ceremony of his statue, but because he's hated using snowplow since season 1. While he does this job, the rest of the Steam team attend the ceremony, where they realise that the statue isn't of Thomas, it's of all of them. Everyone is overjoyed by the event, and when Thomas turns up and sees the sculpture himself, he is relieved and apologises to his friends, who all forgive him. The accuracy to Thomas's character here is phenomenal. He acts like a show-off, but when he sees that his friends are annoyed with him, he tries to fix it by doing one of his least favourite tasks in their service. This is my favourite portrayal of Thomas ever. It's better here than in any episode from the classic and Brenner eras, no doubt. And finally, I love how the statue is used in the episode to show Thomas's arrogance and to symbolise everyone's friendship at the end. So there we have it, 10 overlooked HiT episodes. With episodes like these, I think the HiT era deserves more appreciation, especially considering that this isn't the first time I've made a video on this era. Comment below if there are any episodes from this era that you find to be underrated. Thank you for watching and have a good night.